Good afternoon. Welcome to the Salon focused on energy, climate, and the environment. It's one of the most pressing multidisciplinary research efforts underway at Berkeley right now. That before we get started, I'd like to share a few updates from campus and particularly about our $6 billion campaign, Light the Way. It's been just about a year that COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. That was March 11th, 2020. Our world changed dramatically, and the landscape continues to shift daily, including here at Berkeley. In recent weeks, positive COVID cases surged among students. To help us contain the spread, we required all campus housing residents to self-sequester through February 15th. They were very happy when we lifted the sequester Monday at midnight. We also announced that all department graduations, as well as the campus-wide commencement, will be virtual. What drives every decision, no matter how hard it is to make or to receive, is protecting the health of our community. For example, we've had to slightly push out our plans to offer limited in-person instruction this semester. We're starting by permitting occasional outdoor instructional activities and then moving to pilot a small number of in-person classes indoors. In spite of the pandemic, there continues to be great momentum behind Light the Way, the campaign for Berkeley. We're seeing many positive signs that our community of alumni and friends cares deeply about Berkeley and that what we do in the world resonates especially now. So far, we've raised $4.2 billion toward our $6 billion goal, with just under 3 years to go before the end date of December 31st, 2023. The impact of this philanthropic campaign is formidable for students, faculty, and our ability to do path-breaking research that changes the world. The possibilities of what we can still achieve keep us going, and that's what we're here to learn more about today. From our deep wellspring of fundamental research for good, we have identified multidisciplinary themes that represent critical problems facing our world that Berkeley is ideally suited to address in this decade. One of these themes is energy, climate, and the environment. Global environmental change remains one of the fundamentally defining challenges of our time. I don't think there's a day in the news, including today, where we don't see evidence of a quickly changing climate. In this area, Berkeley has already led the way. For example, our research with low energy buildings is unparalleled. As far back as the energy crisis in 1975, our faculty were among the first to ask what to do about buildings. As a result, we have the nation's leading buildings research program at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and a building science group at our College of Environmental Design. These faculty created the academic foundations and educated countless leaders for today's green buildings movement. Later in the 1980s, Berkeley faculty co-founded the Society for Building Science Educators. Berkeley faculty developed building standards that were later adopted in today's leadership in energy and environmental design, or LEED standards, that all major buildings aspire to achieve. And Berkeley physics professor Art Rosenfeld was the architect of building energy efficient codes and standards, first in California and then nationwide. Building energy work continues today with our Center for the Built Environment, a consortium between UC Berkeley and over 50 industry partners who are leaders in the building field, and with the large and thriving Singapore Berkeley Building Efficiency and Sustainability in the Tropics project, aimed at radically reducing energy use in tropical environments. More recently, faculty member Wendy Silver has pioneered methods to capture compost from agricultural waste streams and add them to rangelands. Her research group has documented in detail how the resources increase production of grasses, benefiting ranchers, and also leave a residue of carbon buried in the soil. This is carbon that otherwise would be lost as compost decomposes, and it would end up in the atmosphere. After replicating these results across multiple sites in different parts of the state, it was approved as a certified practice for farmers. This is another example of the translational pathway from basic research to applications that benefit the climate and our economy. We have numerous other programs working on energy, climate, and environment, including the Energy Institute at Haas, the Multidisciplinary Energy and Resources Group, and many more. As part of this campaign, we're committed to integrating expertise across diverse fields to maximize our impact and break from established thinking to find a better way forward. We know climate change is having a disastrous effect on natural systems and human communities. Innovation and investment are critical to transition to net zero and then negative emissions globally, while simultaneously enhancing energy security and addressing the disproportionate burden of climate change impacts on vulnerable communities. I'm very excited to be able to have this conversation with two of our campus deans who are leading campus efforts in this field, Dean David Ackerly of the Rausser College of Natural Resources and Dean Vishaan Chakrabarti from the College of Environmental Design are here today to talk about the amazing things happening on campus and what the future could be. So I'm going to begin by asking them a few questions, and then we'll open it up for everyone to participate. So question number one, what are the biggest challenges to creating a resilient planet and truly mitigating the pace with which we are emitting CO2? And Vishaan, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate this conversation and for all of your interest in participating. I just want to sort of begin where Carol left off and just kind of starting at the sort of highest level of the picture. The United Nations has upped the estimate for the population, the global population, to for 2100, the end of this century, to 11.3 billion. It used to be a 10 billion person estimate, so it's now 11.3, and that's kind of a steady state, stabilized population where they see population growth kind of leveling. And what's extraordinary about that, if you think about that, is we have 7 billion people today. So if we're going to accommodate another 11.3 billion, I don't think it's our job to wish anyone away. We know those people are coming. So the question is, how do we create a planet in which we can live harmoniously with the planet's resources with 11 billion people on it? And technology is a huge part of the answer, obviously, but it's not the only part of the answer. And by that, I mean, like, so take electric cars, for instance. Electric cars do a lot of great things, but they also have a lot of embodied energy, a lot of rare earths used in the manufacture of their batteries. There's a lot of issues in African nations in terms of how some of those rare earths are mined. And it still doesn't solve the basic problem of sprawl. Consider the fires we all experienced in the Western time zone this year. Since the 1990s, 32 million homes have been built on the wildland-urban interface. And so we not only have to think about technological solutions for climate change, we have to think about habitational solutions in terms of how we use the planet's resources. And we know that if we're going to have that many people on the planet, we have to think about how our communities are built. 70% of global carbon emissions come from buildings and cars. Most people live in cities today. They'll continue to live in cities. But something that David and I speak about frequently is the fact that we can't talk about cities to the exclusion of rural areas and suburban areas, that it's all one big ecosystem. There's an emergent urban-rural divide. We see it not only in terms of climate change and climate justice issues, landscape issues that Ari and others have been involved with, but also in terms of our politics. You're clearly seeing, there aren't blue states and red states. There are blue counties and red counties. So we clearly have a political divide emerging around this urban-rural divide. And then finally, an equity divide, particularly around climate. And I think David's going to talk about that next. So David, do you want to take it over from here?
As first, always good to unmute, the lesson of Zoom. Thanks so much. I mean, I couldn't agree more about these fundamental starting points of this entire discussion around a future a future that brings well-being to the world's population, and that's across the United States, across the entire globe. I want to start just by setting that baseline problem that we know that a true solution to the climate crisis requires that we eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. So in all we do, this is central. And a lot of that has to do with electrification, and we're on this path to renewable energy. The cost of renewable energy has dropped so much faster than anyone expected. It's really set us on a path that even 10 years ago we didn't see as being feasible. And a lot of work still to do eliminating or reducing greenhouse gases from agriculture, from the food systems. So this is really disruptive. And I think about disruptive as Silicon Valley's favorite word, but we also have to think of disruptive for whom? And this really does bring us back to the equity considerations. And this is something at Berkeley that we really are bringing to the fore in all of our climate work. We're certainly not alone, but we really feel it's so central to our approach to all the problems that we try to bring our research to and try to think about solutions. So as we tackle these climate solutions, these emissions reductions, we have to be thinking about how do we ensure energy security for those who need it most. And just today's New York Times, you saw the story, if you saw the story about how low-income communities and communities of color were the first to lose power when the Texas grid went down, and maybe the last to bring it back. And that just goes to the core of how we've designed our systems. And as some communities are able to convert to solar power and become more self-contained, who's left, who's still vulnerable to how we build the shared grid? Who carries the costs of that shared grid as some parts of society are able to maybe decouple a bit? And is that really an equitable solution? We've all fallen on this word resilience, and I read a fascinating essay recently that resilience at its core is saying the ability to return after a disturbance to how things were before. But there are some things we don't want to return to. We don't want to restore inequity. We don't want to return to some of the social challenges we've had. We want to use a moment of disruption more transformationally. Maybe it's more about transformation than about resilience. The opportunity when we're making such big investments to think about what the future could look like. And that's both protecting communities, like these power outages, heat waves, and then at a global scale, when megacities, coastal megacities get hit by sea level rise, the refugee issues that we anticipate, all of these are coming, and they're happening now. We see them happening now, and we believe will accelerate. And then also paying attention, I think about a coal mining community that, if those coal mines do shut down, that's a lot of people whose well-being is impacted. So really thinking deeply about what a just transition is in the energy system means thinking about the impacts across the board. And that's part of all of our thinking on these questions.
Thank you, David and Vishaan. So my next question is about carbon neutrality, and I'd like you to talk about what Berkeley can do to push us toward carbon neutrality in mobility, in net negative carbon emissions for buildings, and what opportunities are on the horizon to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Where can we move the needle in terms of negative emissions? And David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, just a little bit more about some of the technological challenges, and these are all areas that Berkeley has exceptional research. That for this audience, that's something we say all the time because it's so true, the depth of our expertise. In the first step with renewable energy, a lot of the problem we hear about now is the problems of storage. We have solar power coming online, and yet the sun goes down, right? So here we have this phenomenally simple yet spectacularly challenging problem of how do we even take the energy collected in the middle of the day and make it available in the evening when we need it. Lots of research going on, Lawrence Berkeley Lab and campus together on the problems in advanced battery storage and the kind of breakthroughs that will be needed to bring the costs way down. The other thing that is really, now that as people look ahead, there is a consensus that removing carbon from the atmosphere will have to be part of a comprehensive solution. We're simply not slowing down emissions fast enough, and we'll have to reverse it. There's also some emissions that are almost impossible to eliminate. For example, there's no real substitute yet for liquid fuels for aviation and air travel, and we'll always need to somehow offset that. So this is another area. There's three big approaches to removing carbon from the atmosphere. There's industrial approaches, literally just factories using different chemical solvents that can capture CO2. Then there's a problem of storage. Areas of underground storage is really what's being looked at in depth, and this is a long time expertise area at Berkeley. There's a set of geologic solutions, which are quite fascinating. There's classes of rocks that if you break them into very fine particles will capture CO2 and bind it into rock form, which is then it's stable for millions of years potentially. And then there's solutions on the land surface, which has to do, we mentioned the work of Wendy Silver about transformations in agriculture and forest management, how we manage forests for fires, which of course are big carbon emitters. So these are all really important research areas. But then there's also policy and ethical problems. And one of the ones that's so interesting right now is there's a moral hazard problem with carbon removal. And what we see is oil companies potentially saying, well, if we can remove it, then we don't have to stop burning the oil and emitting it. And we know that in the long run, that's not the solution. We have to do both. We have to both stop burning and then remove what we've emitted in the past. But we're already seeing examples where these kinds of debates are shaping how these technologies may unfold. And this is where everything from philosophers and thinking about ethics and values behind our actions, as well as our policy folks, become really important to complement the technological innovation to take these solutions to scale.
So thanks, David. I would just add to that in terms of, I think it's really interesting to talk about both carbon neutrality and carbon negativity in terms of what takes carbon out of the atmosphere. In terms of neutrality, and again, going back to ideas about human habitation, obviously a lot of us have been fighting for more walkable and bikeable communities. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most elegant. And, one of my heroes is the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who's been fighting for what she calls the 15-minute city, in which most people can attain their daily needs in a 15-minute walk. When ideas like that, and I think mayors are particularly important in terms of this, that you can impact millions of people at scale around the world when you start to see these ideas adopted. And we are seeing them in India, in Brazil. There's a major mayoral candidate in New York who's talking about these things. And so it's interesting how sort of infectious that is. But then moving on to sort of carbon negativity, one of the great there's a number of great technological possibilities. There's a really fascinating idea about the idea of transparent solar cells, meaning that all of the windows that we place in our skyscrapers and so forth could become solar cells. And then you have most new buildings being built as kind of gigantic batteries. But then you can move to the idea of what's known as cross-laminated timber, which is basically building buildings out of wood. Who knew this was a revolution? But it is a revolution because we've actually invented forms of wood that have the fire retardance of steel. So you can imagine entire skyscrapers, and there are skyscrapers going up in Germany and Australia right now, made of wood that are natural carbon sinks, and also have great impacts in terms of better forestry and so forth. So you can imagine this urbanism that I was talking about earlier, in the amount of people living in cities being built out of things like wood. But also, if you caught 60 Minutes on Sunday night, Bill Gates was talking about new forms of concrete that you can embed CO2 in as another form of a carbon sink. And so it was interesting in that interview, the extent to which he was focused on the built environment and technologies that we need to invest in carbon sinks in our architecture. So, that's just a couple of examples. There's a lot more, I think, where we could go from the history Carol laid out in terms of what we did in terms of green buildings to this idea of going to carbon negative buildings.
Yeah, thank you. So next question is about the changed administration. There's obviously a new administration with very different views about a robust climate agenda at the federal level. Where do you see the opportunities to have real impact, and what excites you about where the discussions are going right now?
So, just picking up, obviously, Berkeley has been this extraordinary kind of provider to the Biden-Harris administration. There's so many people in the administration from Berkeley, from the vice president to Jennifer Granholm, our Secretary of Energy, and countless others. And, one of the places I'm most excited actually is at the Department of Transportation, where a mayor has taken over and is clearly looking for policies and talking about infrastructure programs that are comprehensive in terms of looking both at the sort of equity needs that David was talking about, combined with climate policy And starting, he said the crazy thing the other day that, maybe we should figure out how to make roadway projects economically self-sufficient the way we always ask mass transit projects to be. And so I think that's really interesting. The last thing I just say about this is, I was a city official under Mayor Bloomberg. I was Manhattan Planning Director after 9/11. And I don't think we can stress enough that a smart administration looks to the academic sector, looks to leaders like Berkeley to translate research into policy. And I think that conduit is so important right now as we start to think about a new administration and how we could influence policy in terms of the research that's done here.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons we've learned, a well-known lesson is California does not solve global problems simply by solving a problem in California. It's the example we set. So to paraphrase, what happens in California does not stay in California. The best known example from 30, 40 years ago was our having our own air standards for cars, and the fact that the federal government recognized that California was allowed to set its own standards. And then that became the standard that everyone aspired to in that industry. And then eventually the car companies come on board and say it's more efficient for business to be planning towards a single target. And California has been able to be in that leadership role. The thing I'm really excited about right now is, just as an example of an exceptional role for universities. Universities have, on the one hand, we push the envelope, we push for new ideas. At the same time, we always step back from the politics a bit, and we are that sort of neutral gathering place where people can come together and share the best ideas. And one of the wonderful examples is when Governor Jerry Brown stepped down from the governor's office in California. Just at that moment, he had actually committed to forming a joint climate institute with his counterparts in China. And we brought that institute and provided a home for it here at Berkeley. So between the College of Natural Resources and Berkeley Law, we have the California China Climate Institute. Governor Brown is a visiting professor, and the chair, Mary Nichols, who's the architect of California's climate policy, just joined the institute as vice chair. And Governor Brown's own senior staff have moved and now set up shop as Berkeley staff with very strong philanthropic support. And they have maintained the highest level dialogue between government leaders in the United States and China, even in the face of all the tensions. They've kept the door open, they've kept the conversations going. And then on January 20th, people from Washington can rejoin those conversations again. In the meantime, we kept them going. So during these years when there was so little discussion going on, a university could step in and play, a diplomatic role, a kind of shadow diplomatic role, because we are that kind of fair arbiter in the sense of those discussions. So this is just something I'm really excited about. And now we do have members of the Biden administration tapping right into those channels to reestablish their connections in China. And then that's the high level. And then the Institute will also be facilitating training. There were many, many plans for exchange of personnel. Of course, all of those are on hold for the year until we're back traveling again. But that's just one example of where California really plays an outsized role, and where the UC system and Berkeley can play an enormously outsized global role at facilitating discussions that scale up and have extraordinary impact. So we're really excited to see how that institute is one example where the shift in Washington will allow us to take what we've been doing in California and take it to the national scale. And that in the research, we certainly, this is an administration that's looking to the long haul for the investments that are needed for long-term solutions, and that's where we're at our best, is thinking about the long-term solutions and how to bring them to the ground. And we really look forward to the support for what we do and the collaboration, of course, to have impact. So it's an exciting moment for those of us working on climate.
Thank you. My final question is a question about philanthropy. In the broadest terms is, how can philanthropy at Berkeley help stop climate change? But more specifically, where are there gaps at Berkeley where a philanthropic investment could make a difference and help the state and the nation and the globe bear the fruits of science to solutions research that would help us mitigate and adapt to climate change? And how can we leverage the federal agenda that's been emerging?
Yeah, I'll start. I think one of the climate change is just one of those deeply and intrinsically interdisciplinary problems that certainly respects no boundaries, no political boundaries and no ecosystem boundaries, but also no disciplinary boundaries. And that's where that is where universities sometimes run up against obstacles because we're all busy in our colleges and our departments. Faculty have enormous responsibilities to their students, to the teaching programs. And it's where support can pull people up and bring them together for these interdisciplinary challenges. One of the wonderful examples is the potential of bringing in clusters of faculty. And with support from Carol and her administration, we're just in the process of a series of cluster hires, including one on climate equity. We've just made offers to an incredibly exciting group of young faculty across 4 departments, actually, and someone else coming in from public health on another search. So we'll have a whole group of young faculty spanning multiple colleges and departments. And then our challenge is to make sure we resource them so that they have that opportunity to work together. For example, the seed money to bring projects to light, which then really makes them competitive for federal support or foundation support. I mean, so it's at every level from, of course, hiring new faculty. Many of you have, I'm sure, you've probably heard from Carol before that the future of growth of the faculty at Berkeley will not rest entirely from Sacramento. It's very much in our own hands. That's a very important investment, and then helping those people come together. So I start with the faculty. It's what makes everything happen at the university, and they're extraordinary people. And the key is who we bring in for the next generation. Vishaan, what would you add?
So I would just double down on that for a minute, in the sense that, I'm a relatively new dean. I've been here for about 6 months. And I think one of the great parts of my job is the camaraderie among deans and the level of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, pandisciplinary, whatever you want to call it, work that goes on here. And I think if you just consider the scope of the problems we've outlined, it's just very clear that this is not going to be solved by any one department or any one discipline. And so the cluster David mentioned, the faculty that are working in an interdisciplinary manner across the campus are critical, and their support is critical. And what I would really add to that are then the graduate students, the PhD students, the master's students, the undergraduate students who do research with them. And that has a kind of manifold effect in terms of supporting those students. Many of our students come from marginalized or minoritized backgrounds. Our unit happens to have some of the most diverse students on campus, actually, which is extraordinary. And so they not only want to come and research these things and need the support to do that, but they want to go back to the kinds of communities that are suffering from some of the climate injustices that David spoke about and really have an impact on the ground. So it's not just the research they do here at Berkeley, which is critical, but also, what that sort of sets them on as a path as they go throughout their lives. So it has this huge multiplier effect in terms of both the work we do here and the work they go on to do to lead a kind of life of learning and do the work that they're going to do out in the world, including entering, White House administrations and other things that are happening now. So, I just pair David's passion for the faculty with our passion for the students and having the right kind of student support in these efforts, because they want to be there. They just need the support to do it.
Thank you. So now we have time for you to ask your questions. So I'd like to throw it open. I'm going to put you on gallery view so I can see you raise your hands, and just either raise your hand physically or use the little hand, the hand icon, or you can write a question in the chat. Yeah, Ari.
Hi, I have a question for just a general question about what Berkeley can do in terms of rethinking of education to reduce carbon footprint, and also bring more equity and allow students from poor communities to come to the university. Do we need to start thinking about education is not a one-time thing, whether you come to college for 4 years and then you're done with your education? It's more of a continuous thing that you have to keep learning lifelong. In that case, the 4-year college makes sense can be reduced to 3 years college. And then if you really want to study, then to go for 2 years master's and something like that. I mean, is there any way to relook at the way we are teaching students and given the new technology we have, given the internet and distance learning? So that's my question.
Thank you. That's a really rich question.
Well, I'm going to jump in on one part. I would love to hear Carol's answer on some of those bigger questions of the nature of universities and how they may change. But, I think a lot of us knew in principle that technology could change the way we educate. And then being thrown into COVID, it was just nothing could have accelerated things faster. So in fact, we're launching right now a set of discussions about what, post COVID, what do we make sure that we take advantage of, and what have we learned here that we keep in our system, because we know it has the potential to dissolve boundaries. What we're doing right here, we just dissolve space. If we'd invited all of you to come to campus for this conversation, you can check your schedule and think that's not, we can't do that. I'm not coming to campus for a 45-minute conversation, right? And yet we can gather so easily for this kind of event. Go into a little bit more specifics. My college, which is historically very focused on undergrad and PhD, is certainly pivoting and having to address more seriously the role of master's education, because we know that it's needed for students in terms of being competitive, and it's part of where we serve the workforce. But it is there's some existential changes which are more challenging for some parts of campus than others to rethink our core business model. As a public university, I think part of it is how much the state is sort of partners with us if we're really fundamentally going to rethink it. So I think you throw out some possibilities there that are much more profound than what I touched on. But I'm curious if either of the others on this panel have other thoughts on that one.
Yeah, Vishaan, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, just quickly. I would just add that, I think it's a great and really super interesting question. I do think that we need more of a culture of alumni coming back and re-engaging as much as possible. And especially in terms of ongoing executive education and so forth. I find that most professionals, as they get out into the field, remain really hungry for state-of-the-art knowledge and state-of-the-art education. And so I think having that feedback loop is a critical and great idea. I do think, as horrible as the pandemic has been, it really does open that possibility. Now, I'm an architect, so I'm always going to believe in the power of physical space and the power of campus. But I do think that this notion that we could have ongoing learning virtually for people who want to participate and kind of stay up to speed with all the research and all the great things that are happening at Berkeley is clearly now a new and very fertile ground for possibility in terms of what you're asking about, Ari.
Yeah, I think it's such a wonderful question. If I might, just say a few things. I don't. First of all, we have to keep our own house green, if you will, and so moving toward carbon neutrality as a campus, or negative carbon emissions, is really important. We're involved in an analysis right now about how we can have a completely electrified campus, but I just don't think we're ever going to go back to traveling in the way that we once did. I think that, our forced immersion in the Zoom world is going to make this a tool that we're going to use a lot, whether it's in work in a daily way, or salons like this, or travel for conferences. I just think we've seen the end of the days where you spend, a day and a half traveling to go to a day and a half meeting in some place halfway around the world and then come back for a day and a half. I think that people are going to work differently. Other questions that people have for David and Vishaan? I have a question. One of the things I've been really interested in this space is student activism. It's one of the issues that students feel most passionately about. I often have students in my office, when we weren't in COVID times, advocating for some environmental cause or another. And I'm really interested in how you see student activism in terms of the programs that you are trying to develop.
I'll try on that one. That's a great question, Carol. I got off the phone just about an hour ago with a group of students. We have incredibly activist students, both at the grad and undergrad level. They are impatient, and what I find so refreshing is you cannot really talk about climate change without talking about equity for these students. It's interesting. I mentioned that Bill Gates interview, and there was a lot of criticism online about how technocratic a lot of his responses were, because they really weren't filtered through the lens of equity. And this is something that our students absolutely insist upon because they know enough, especially because of the communities from which they hail, that there are downstream consequences to almost any technological, advancement, and they want to understand that up front. And so I I sense that, so when we talk about, for instance, brownfield sites and, all the amount of climate remediation that has to be done in Black and brown communities in particular. So I sense that there's just, we also gone is the day when we're going to talk about sort of just pure technocratic solutions to this climate problem. It has to always be viewed through the lens of equity, racial justice, and so forth. And I think that's actually a really good thing. I think it's going to help us advance the cause. I don't think it's going to slow the cause.
Yeah, I would echo Vishaan's comments exactly. I'm not sure I have, you said it beautifully. I think one of the fascinating things about being at any university, and Berkeley more than any other, is on the one hand, we embrace these amazing faculty who, who spend their entire careers. So we have this very long, slow turnover of people who've been there 20, 30, 40 years. And then the students who are constantly coming and going and keeping us on our toes and pushing us. And that's just built into how we work. That's built into the very nature of the institution. So that kind of activist pressure from students, we embrace it because it's sort of what we're built to do. But boy, do they keep us on our heels sometimes because we can't move fast enough to respond to the hopes and the dreams and they have a better understanding of where society is going. And sometimes we're playing catch up, and they educate us every day. It's one of the beauties of being it's one of the privileges of being at the university is, of course, that constant interaction with the new generation. Yeah.
Other questions from the people at the
I think
Salon?
Carrie has a question in the chat.
Oh, yes. Do you think that food production will move closer to populations, or will industrial farms scale up? That's a really good question.
It's a wonderful question. There's the most impactful book I've read in the last couple of years. It's called The Wizard and the Prophet. And it's a wonderful analysis of the environmental movement across the 20th century. And it poses Herman Borlaug, who is the godfather of the Green Revolution, against a much less known fellow named Vogt, I think V-O-G-T, who really was the first prophet. He's the prophet. So Borlaug's the wizard, like the industrial, the industrial farm, the high production, high productivity, and move the food around the world, get it where we need it. And Vogt was really the prophet of living within limits. And that really is what's behind the local food movement or the organic movement or bringing it closer. And it's a very profound book because it just shows how it played out in every sector, from energy to water to climate to food. It's just a very deep philosophical tug, all among people who really want to solve this problem. And I think this actually captures attention it captures attention we feel at the university as well, because we have faculty who pursue solutions, who are, the more technocratic innovation versus the more community-based agriculture, things like that. So if any of you, it may have been a long time since you've been in the classroom, but you may have noticed that I avoided answering the question. That was the professorial skill at just saying, yes, it's a very difficult problem. We don't know what's going to happen. No, I don't know the answer, Carrie. And maybe the best thing to say is that we need every tool in the toolbox. The worst thing we can do is a priori on sort of moral grounds, for example, say we simply are not going to use a certain approach, because there's a common expression in climate world. There's no silver bullet. It's silver buckshot, which is to say we just need dozens of magical solutions, which collectively may add up. So and on agriculture, I am not a prophet of what the world will look like in 50 years in terms of how we move forward.
I mean, I would like to add, though, I do think we need to fight for far more local food production. And again, this is where sprawl is extraordinarily damaging, right? There is nothing that is hurting our capacity to grow food locally more than the fact that we are eating up urban farmland that can support urban living because we're eating them up with suburban subdivision. And you don't have to go very far in California to see that. And so this is where these things are all tied at the hip. And again, going back to these urban rural divide questions, because, we have to stop thinking about this as a zero-sum game. We have to think about the fact that if urban economies grow, the rural economies around them should be able to grow at the same time, because they are supplying their food, their cross-laminated timber, their fish, their, like, you know, and this is the problem that we have. And I think this is something that is, it's a huge interdisciplinary problem. And like David, I'm not going to have a crystal ball, but I think there are some directions we can point in terms of where the world needs to go, and where a lot of sort of smarter countries have been going in terms of local food supply. The last thing is just, if you're interested in this topic, I really encourage you to look up the bio of Charisma AC. She is one of our star faculty. She just became director of the Berkeley Food Initiative. She grew up in public housing. She has the most extraordinary bio. But you know, if you want to get inspired by someone doing work on the ground about food, Charisma is your person.
That's great. Are there other questions from all of you? Yes,
I have
Cheryl.
a question. One of the issues is with homelessness and the affordability, especially in California, of housing, and how to match, you know, having sustainability and green housing and food insecurity, and the issue with, excuse me, with housing. So how is it that, and I know this isn't a totally answerable question at this point, how are we going to solve all of those problems together?
Maybe I'll take a swing at this, Cheryl. Thank you. This is one of my favorite questions, although I have no idea what the full answer is. But I think together is a really great caveat to the question, because we do have to solve it together. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the Turner Center, which is run by Carol Galante, just an extraordinary figure, former housing official in the Obama administration. They just celebrated their 5-year anniversary, and Governor Newsom came on for the celebration and said that California housing policy is almost directly flowing from the Turner Center into Sacramento. We have a huge problem on our hands. And frankly, we have problems in progressive communities that are fighting homeless supportive housing, affordable housing, and so forth. So we have a political issue. We have a huge technological issue. In San Francisco today, the average affordable housing unit costs about $600,000 per unit to build. There are other, there's this great organization called the Tipping Point that's helped to bring down that cost by almost half. There's modular housing. So there's a tremendous amount we need to do, but it is both a research problem and in terms of technology, and a public policy problem in terms of getting us to upzone the areas around transit. And the last thing I'd say is it goes back to the mobility problem, because if we have fewer transit deserts, have more mass transit, we can put more affordable housing in areas that are less developed and so forth. So it is a together problem. And I just think we do have a lot of people studying this right now. And so I'd love to talk to you about it further. It's a great topic.
Yeah, and I think I definitely, I always like hearing Vishaan's answer on these urbanism problems. This has been, and I just can't help to editorialize what a pleasure as a dean to have someone like Vishaan come to Berkeley and join us, and as a new colleague, because it is a moment of great collaboration across all our schools. You know, I'm a biodiversity scientist, so I come into this originally as a researcher thinking about conservation biologists and wildlands. And it was only a few years ago that it just became so clear to me that one of the most important solutions to the biodiversity problem is solving the housing problem. And the more we succeed with high density, high quality cities, the less pressure there is on the land, whether it's for farmland or for open space and parks. So those are aligned as solutions, but it certainly requires, you can't tell people to like a city. The cities have to be desirable, and it has to be part of a set of shared values. And this is the tragedy of COVID, to see people fleeing from cities and grabbing, you know, the technology is allowing people to jump past the sprawl and go and live in Colorado or live in, you know, an island off British Columbia and be at work, right? So who knows what that looks like when sort of we quote unquote return to normal. But it's certainly a worry that COVID has reversed some trends that we're heading in, I think, a more favorable direction, just in terms of you know, the growing quality of cities in the last 20 years and the shift in housing. But where's that headed, Vishaan?
Thanks, David. Sorry, and thank you for that shout out. Just one other quick thing on this. Part of the problem we have is globally. So Mumbai, the city of Mumbai, is growing by 2,000 people a day because they are shedding population from the farmlands and the rural lands, which we saw during the pandemic became an enormous crisis. If we don't better sustain our rural economies, there will be more and more pressure on cities to provide affordable housing because people aren't finding the economic livelihood they need in rural economies. That's just as true here. 70% of the population is increasingly going to 7 or 8 mega regions across the United States, and we're decanting population in all these other places that need more sustainable economies, so they're not putting so much pressure on the big cities. So it's a very multifaceted problem.
Other questions that you have?
I just have one more comment to make. I think because of the pandemic, I think, as David was saying, we were going kind of in the right direction around, trying to have more density and to rely more on public transportation and that kind of thing. But because of the pandemic, I admit that I haven't taken BART for a long time because I'm afraid of, the transmission of the virus. So, I think there are a lot of things caught up in this, including things like in San Francisco or in California, the cost of building. It's astronomical to build in California versus some other places in the United States, let alone the world. So it's a multifaceted problem in my mind. Every time I ask the question, I think of another one just because there's so many parts to it. So I applaud you for, thinking about it, but, I hope because our university has so many experts in many fields that you'll stretch out besides your own departments.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the things that COVID has done is it really is pressing people across boundaries because so many of the problems of the pandemic just cannot be solved in a silo. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I mean, for the average citizen, it looks, excuse me, it looks like things are changing so fast as far as the environment is concerned. Is that, do you have the same feelings that things are accelerating very quickly as far as the environment, the deterioration? And the other second question would be, what worries you the most?
Mm.
Well, I'll just jump in on the pure climate science. My answer would be yes, it's very sobering. At every point when their models have projected the pace of climate change, it's always gone faster than it's been projected at each stage. Impacts have come sooner than we expected them. Nothing's been coming slower, or we overestimated how fast. And frankly, you go back to Jim Hansen testifying to Congress in 1985 or 86, and he pretty much nailed exactly the trajectory we would be on. But I think what wasn't anticipated fully was how quickly it would turn into like the hurricane strength or the fire events. Like the average temperature change has been known for 30 or 40 years, but this translation to on the ground impact. I'll just say that working in this area, there's kind of a cognitive dissonance because you have to be able to take seriously how significant those impacts are, and yet always believe it can be addressed and solved. Because if you didn't believe it, we wouldn't get up and go to work every day if you really thought that there weren't solutions within reach. So only our children and grandchildren may be able to look back and say whether we understood at the right time how serious it was, or whether we jumped on it fast enough. And in the meantime, we believe we are optimists at heart, I think, even in the face of such sobering realities.
I mean, Larry, I would add to that. I love this question. I mean, what worries me the most, I mean, frankly, we've had about 2 billion people move from poverty into the middle class in the last 20 years in the world. And that trend is accelerating. And in many ways, that is a great thing. But the problem we have is that if 5, 7, 10 billion people choose to live the way we sort of set out what success means, a big house, several cars, the planet cannot sustain that. I mean, I've taken low-flying air flights over Riyadh, and it looks just like the sprawl around Phoenix. And, you know, when you just start thinking about the multiplier impacts of that, which is why, going back to Cheryl's comment, I think coming out of the pandemic, it's interesting. Urban habitation has always changed in response to pandemics. Most of our codes, zoning codes, health codes, etc., came from cholera, tuberculosis, even the plague. And so I'm really hoping coming out of this, our cities will bounce back, but habitation can't just resume the form that it had before the pandemic. And I think that's something that we all really need to think about if we're going to have, you know, a global success story in terms of people coming out of poverty, but doing it with a different definition of what success means.
Larry, I think that's such a wonderful question. The thing that worries me the most is the way in which each of the crises that we're now in the middle of is an inequity amplifier. And you worry about how much stress the system can take without something in the social compact breaking badly.
I just want to respond. Carrie put a comment in the chat, which I think is really important since we're talking so much about urbanism and then the impacts of the pandemic. You know, to paraphrase, is it such a bad thing if people move to small cities, small towns whose economies are hurting, and spread out some of the wealth of Silicon Valley or others? And that actually, I would agree. That to me, that sort of resonates at some core level. I think you know, Vishaan has said sprawl several times. It's kind of that sprawl in between. I mean, lots of small urban centers, I think, can recreate some of the values. People are not driving a long way to work necessarily if they're able to live in those places, shopping locally. It's kind of that blanket of housing in between that, of course, we see expanding across the Central Valley in California, which is so sobering. And yet we have to look at why are people doing that? Well, we just look at the cost of housing, the cost of living along the coast, and it drives people to where it's affordable. And, you know, people make rational decisions. So we have to do the work to set up choices that are desirable and make those alternatives really realistic. But I like your point, Carrie, about I think we all love those small country towns that bring back a little bit of the of an older time.
It all depends on what the sort of kind of way in which that town lives. Like, you know, the most sustainable place I've ever been on the planet is the village in northern India where my father was born. Very small village, barely had electricity, but there was no waste. You could never find a garbage can. Everything was reused. And so it's incredibly, it's not just about big cities, but it's about the design of those places. Do you have to drive everywhere? What are the buildings made of? You know, and how is nature respected beyond the boundaries of that small town? You know, it's those things that I think are really important.
So the 15-minute city and the 15-minute village.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you for making time to be with us today. I particularly thank David and Vishaan for just a fascinating conversation. Berkeley is well positioned to lead in solution-oriented research and education to address this global crisis. The university brings a unique breadth of strengths needed to confront this challenge, from discovery-based science to technological innovation to social science, law, policy, and the design of business incentives. I hope you will join us on this journey. Thank you so much for attending today. Fiat Lux, and go Bears.
Thank you.